For our next panel, amazing panel, Russell has prepared mind-blowing welcoming remarks. But before he does, I want to introduce the panel to the stage. There will be a brilliant panel. The panelists include moderator Roxanne Stone. Give it up for Roxanne. Curtis Chang, Nancy French, and Russell Moore will join us. You all have to sit down and look at Russell as he gives us a brilliant, illuminating speech. Russell Moore is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and co-founder of the After Party Project. He will share insights into the societal challenges and the divisive political climate of the past 8 years and what inspired his book, Losing Our Religion, and the creation of the After Party Project. Give it up for Russell Moore.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you. And since I'm a preacher, I want to begin by reading a passage from Christian scriptures from the New Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, starting with verse 13, in which the scripture says this. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, or others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and started to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man." In the year 2020, when all of us were in this earthquake of a deeply, deeply contentious presidential election, the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, and of course a microscopic virus that shut down the entire world and killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. There was a little known archaeological discovery that took place, getting not nearly as much attention as those things for obvious reasons. And it was in the place known as Caesarea Philippi, in which a 4th century Byzantine church was found. And underneath the 4th century Byzantine church was a more ancient pagan temple to the god Pan, that was dated to about 20 BC. And you look at this and you realize, here you have a place named after Caesar, after the house of Herod, at the place of the worship of a god known for unrestrained chaos, and who could literally enact panic upon people. And yet, Gospel of Matthew presents a Jesus who is not panicked and who maintains this calm tranquility in the place named after the very empire that would execute him, a place that is set up for the worship of the unrestrained appetite. And Jesus instead speaks of the way of the cross, something very different from panic and power. And that's really the burden behind what we have attempted to do together as we work on the After Party Project. We look around specifically at a evangelical Christian community in the United States of America in which many people are exhausted from the family division, exhausted from the church division, exhausted from the adrenal fatigue of perpetual outrage. And many are asking, is there a different way? And one of the things that we have concluded is that what we have seen happening in many of our own evangelical communities turns out to be the very thing we were warned about, which is the secularization that will remove the supernatural and end up with something very different. We have seen the secularization of concepts of spiritual warfare, in which you have language of demonization from biblical passages literally meant for demons, and saying we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly places, being directed toward our neighbors. And we see a lack of confidence in the power of the gospel itself, that has to be replaced with mechanisms for power and coercion. So we see suggestions from some sectors of Christian nationalism that not only would have been unimaginable just a few years ago in a mainstream setting, but directly contradict what the central emphasis of evangelical Christianity is, which is the need for the person to be born again, with a kind of external conformity to whoever has the majority at the moment. We don't think that's the way of Christ. We also think that it is not the way of Christ to be focused on ends and not focused on means. There is no way even to accomplish good things while destroying one's soul and one's witness in the process. And we believe that long-term integrity is more important than influence. And having a group of people with such a confidence in the gospel that they are willing to ask, how do we then live even in crazy times like these? How do you maintain a Christian witness that does not see our neighbors as our enemies, that sees the tools of the gospel as being persuasion and witness, not coercion and power? And where do we go at the end of all of the exhaustion and the insanity? So what the after party is intended to do is to gather people together in small groups to talk through not the what of politics. There is no Christian worldview training here with a Christian position on immigration or a Christian position on affirmative action or any other issue. It's on the how of politics. How do we live in a politicized environment like this without yielding to the spirit of the age? How are we able to have disagreements and have disagreements well without turning things over to mob violence, whether literal or metaphorical? And in that, what we hope to model is the kind of confidence in our Christianity that does not lead to frantic panic, that does not lead to the grasping for the sword for the purpose of power, but instead reminds us what our Sunday school classes should have taught us in Christian churches long ago. You must be born again. That's what we hope to do with the after party and related projects. So thank you for having us here with you for this conversation.
Thank you, Russell. Good afternoon. I will now make the obligatory remark about getting the panel right after lunch. I hope you stay awake. Please don't yawn, blah, blah, blah. Thanks a lot. Anyway, it's great to have everybody here. It's a lot of fun to celebrate RNS. And obviously, this panel, you're going to hear from 3 evangelicals. And we're talking now about depolarization, and really the evangelical church in many ways over the last 8 years has been sort of facing polarization in a dramatic way that I hope all of us here, whether we're evangelical or something completely different, can sort of take stock of how this is affecting congregations across the map. And what can we learn from our history, and also what can we learn from other groups around us as they're also facing some of these challenges. So thank you so much to our panelists for being here. And Curtis, I'm going to start with you. In your role at Redeeming Babel, you work to address what you see as underlying theological problems that are driving this kind of polarization. So talk a little bit for a moment about that, but I also want to hear, as you're out there, as you're talking to evangelicals, and maybe especially as you're talking to pastors, what are some of the main themes you're hearing from them as they sort of faced these divisions within their churches and this sort of like the anxiety and chaos of the current political moment?
It's a great question. Let me work backwards to what I'm hearing, and I think Russell also is hearing from pastors, which is a lot of concern for what's happening in their congregations in terms of, one comment we hear frequently is, Fox News gets my congregation for 25 hours a week. I get them for 1. Who's going to win? And so there's a sense of a paralysis, but also a sense of fear. There's a real sense of, I don't know what to do with the fact that my congregation is either going one way or splitting even internally in the church. And the paralysis, I think, in some ways has to do with, one, they have not been equipped for this moment. Most pastors did not get a degree in political philosophy. That's not why they got into the game of pastoring, is to deal with political polarization. So substantively, they're not equipped with it, and theologically, they need resourcing for it. But there's also a strategic or pedagogical issue at play, which is the big tool in a classic evangelicals pastor's toolkit is the Sunday morning sermon. That's their big tool that they spend most of their time working on, and they're used to thinking if there's a problem, I preach and I teach. The problem with that is if you think about political polarization, it's not an issue that responds well to a sudden sermon launched out of the blue on this topic from your pastor. It's too complex. There's too many emotions involved. I'm a former pastor. That's the classic pastor sermon that you asked me to preach that I'm imagining what my Monday morning inbox looks like, and it's ugly, and so I don't want to go there. And so I think a lot of pastors just on the ground floor, they don't know what to do. It's not that they're Christian nationalists. It's not that they're, even that they're utterly completely want to avoid. They just don't have the right, they sense intuitively getting up on Sunday morning and preaching about it is probably going to make things worse, not better. And so that actually speaks to the design of the after party, which is we're trying to actually shift the conversation, not from the Sunday morning context, which is one-way communication, easy to be misunderstood, easy to say something that triggers some sort of reaction or fear, and instead move the conversation to actually one of the great strengths of the evangelical church is that we still meet together in this thing called small groups. So this is Bible study, Sunday school, men's prayer breakfast, women's prayer breakfast, but some weekly, bi-weekly gathering, which is still face-to-face, embodied relationships of trust and history. These are the people who, when your wife had surgery, they rallied around and delivered the meal train for. A conversation about politics in that context, face-to-face, embodied relationships with a history of casserole sharing behind it, it just changes the conversation. It opens up things in a way that I think allows more room for moderation, for listening, for learning, for understanding differences. And so what the after party is doing is trying to provide content in a structured way so that it's a plug-and-play 6-week curriculum for small groups to go through that actually takes people through the content of what Russell just laid out, of how to think about politics from a perspective of a Jesus-centered how, not a partisan divided what of politics. So that's the essential strategy that I think is what we're trying. I'll say one other element of it, because I think hopefully what is helpful to you is to realize that all of our religious communities that all of you are speaking to and represent, we have to figure out not just the message that's relevant for our community the way that Russell described, but also the delivery vehicle. That the delivery vehicle is critical to the effectiveness of our work to promote understanding, toleration, basic sort of the basic values of our various religious faiths that are important in this moment of polarization. And so the small group version of the after party is one way that expresses. The other, I'll just say as an example, is that we have also produced a worship album called The Songs for the After Party. Because in the evangelical community, we are formed, and this is true in practically every religious community, we are formed as much by what we sing in worship as much as what we read or study. And so one of the things we realized was that we had a lack of good songs, worship songs, to speak, to sing a more healthy view of politics centered on Jesus. So so now it's the course, the book, and the worship album. So that's some of what we're trying to do at the after party, and we're getting some really great traction. We've 150,000 users already of the course, more with the book, and the worship album is growing. So we're seeing some really great traction.
Nancy, let me turn to you, and maybe you can give us a sense of what this feels like. What does depolarization, or what does a polarized community really feel like? You, in your book, Ghosted, you describe how you and your husband, David French, were something of darlings in conservative circles until Trump came along. And when you opposed Trump, many of your former friends ghosted you. And so talk a little bit about, you've said that you didn't change, but the world changed around you. So talk about how that felt to have your friends change around you, and how you knew this was more than just like political disagreements, but it was a true fork in the road.
So I'm a ghostwriter. Most people when you see a book by a celebrity on the shelf, it's usually written by someone like me, like 99% of the time, just some person that you don't know who's toiling to meet this deadline. And so I ended up, as a college dropout, being a ghostwriter for GOP politicians. So I lived with Sarah Palin for a month in Wasilla. I worked with the Romneys and Ben Sass and all of these, because I grew up with Ronald Reagan posters on my wall. And I just became this, my spiritual gift was owning the libs, not listed in 1 Corinthians. But I loved it. And so I was so good. I would go to Fox News and sit off camera, and I would figure out the perfect way to skewer a Democrat. And then I got convicted by the Holy Spirit that I was breaking the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments specifically that I was breaking was I was bearing false witness against my liberal neighbor. Now, I don't have any liberal neighbors, but if I did, I would bear false witness against them. And so I realized I was just mischaracterizing. So if there was like some person in Topeka, Kansas, who was a Democrat who did something asinine, I would have my celebrity politicians say, well, isn't that how Democrats are? They're just, whatever, fill in the blank. So I was convicted by the Holy Spirit that I would have been embarrassed and infuriated if a liberal writer would have said that, finding a person in Appalachia who did something, less than perfect, and say, well, that's how conservative Christians are. So I found myself at a crossroads, because being a college dropout, I don't have any other occupational opportunities. And but I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't feel like God had given me my writing talent to be acrimonious. And so I literally was on Donald Trump's campaign plane and doing the work that I did, I was contractually obligated to do. And someone was like, hey, come up and get a picture with Trump for your grandkids. And I had this moment of clarity. I was in the wrong place, geographically and occupationally. I had to get out of there. And so when I made that decision, I became about as popular as head lice. Additionally, my husband, David French, who writes for the New York Times, has caused a few headlines because he also, even though we always tell people we're too conservative to vote for Trump, but we've been labeled, a bunch of things. And it's been horrible because I love my clients. I still do. All of my clients I love. But I felt, for example, if I'm a celebrity ghostwriter, I'm like, they would come to me and they'd say, I need to write for X paper about immigration. They wouldn't say to me, let's sit down and have a talk about immigration so you could write it. I knew what they would write. So I would write. So I was really good. I was a good investment because I knew exactly what conservative politicians should say about pretty much every issue. Until I was standing in church in Columbia, Tennessee, and I saw the moment when Donald Trump tweeted out that he prefers his heroes not to have been captured. It was the John McCain insult that was so awful. I just couldn't believe it. So I read it out loud to my friends at church, and I expected everybody to be aghast because we were pro-military. My husband joined the military after 9/11, and we surely would not make fun of a prisoner of war, even if you disagreed with McCain-Feingold, which I did. But I read it out loud, and the Christians around me laughed. And then I got home to my email, and my celebrity clients were like, we need to really write about this. And I was like, oh, do we need to condemn it? Because this is really bad, because we are the party that celebrates X, Y, and Z. And they were like, oh. So I won that battle, but the battles just kept coming. And eventually I became so annoying to my clients because they didn't hire me to challenge them. They hired me to write what they wanted to write. And they were right to, I don't know if I was fired exactly, maybe in one instance, but I was fired or I quit all of my jobs and I became basically unemployable. And so I was occupationally adrift, and everyone in my community is angry at me. Like at one point, the FBI showed up at the house because we were on Cesar Sayoc's pipe bomb list, along with like all the prominent Democrats. I don't know how we got on it. The guy must not have read David's complete works. But I had to go to my neighbors' houses in this very Republican neighborhood and knock on their door because the FBI told me to warn them not to open their freaking packages in case it's a pipe bomb. So I became very popular in my neighborhood as well. And so in the past few years, I've just felt politically homeless. I felt sad. I felt full of grief and lament. And I might not even be the best person on this panel because I'm severely wounded by this cultural moment, as probably all of us are.
Thank you. Russell, I'm sure that a lot of people here are familiar with your more public break with the Southern Baptist Convention. And as we're sitting here talking about attempts to depolarize, talk about sort of where is the line when you decide it's better to leave than to stay, when it's better to reform from the outside rather than within. How did you kind of come to that conclusion? And as you look back on that, what are you thinking about in your current role in terms of like reforming from within?
Well, that question of how long do I stay and when do I leave is one that is facing almost everybody in some way or the other right now. And there's no simple way to work through it. I think instead, the counsel that I give to most people is to know yourself enough to know what is your default position and shore up the other end of that. So I left once, but stayed for all of my life up until that point, and had come to the conclusion I'm really not going to be able to change this ecosystem for a variety of reasons, and so it was best for me in that case to leave. I would never have left if it hadn't been for my then 15-year-old son going to my wife and saying, has Dad had an affair or something? You can be honest with me. I can handle it. And I said, well, Samuel, why don't you go with me to the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee meeting, which is not anything I had ever inflicted on any of my children, but did that one time. And as we left, he said, Dad, I just don't know why you are so captive to this. This was so stupid and angry and crazy, even before they got to your part. Why do we want to be a part of this? And I started to see through his eyes a situation. I did not want him to associate that with Jesus. And I also recognized that I had an enculturation, which I think was mostly good, into Southern Baptist life. I grew up from the womb forward in Southern Baptist life that really communicated there are other Christians, bless their hearts, they're doing the best they can, but we're Southern Baptists, and we are the greatest missionary force on the face of the planet. So it was very, very difficult to walk away from that, and I had to get to a point where I couldn't see any way to stay in that system while at the same time knowing what I knew about how it was operating. And also knowing that even though you have most of the people in the pews, I believe to be good, solid, sincere people, most of them, I think, don't really understand the psychology of the conflict entrepreneurs who wish to keep things in a constant frenzy. So that was my conclusion. I think other people come to different conclusions to work that through. But I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is that there is, not just in the church and not just in religious institutions, but in institutional life generally, there is a shaking. There are old coalitions that are falling apart, new coalitions that are starting. So David Frum, writer for The Atlantic, talks about this in terms of his life within the Republican Party. And he said, I realized at one point that there were people, we thought we were doing the same thing, but what I considered to be a peripheral issue, I now know they consider to be central. And what I believe to be central, they believe to be peripheral. That is happening in almost every institution in American life right now. And that's traumatic and painful, but it's also true that new things are happening. And we have to be aware of that. At the congregational level, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do with the after party is not so much to help people in purple congregations to stay together. There are very few of those right now with the kind of sorting that's happening. But even completely red congregations are divided, and completely blue congregations are divided. I had within 24 hours a very conservative Bible church pastor in Texas and a very progressive Episcopal priest in Northern Virginia tell me almost the exact same story, just mirror images of each other, which is our congregation all votes alike. We think alike on most things. The pastor and the congregation agree on all of that, but there's constant conflict between what is going to be made central. And are these political affiliations going to become a part of tribal belonging, or is it something else? And so there's all kinds of ferment going on, and I think new things are starting to happen.
Yeah. Curtis, when I grew up in an era where there was a lot of conversation about seeker-sensitive churches. A lot of megachurches would have labeled themselves that way. And part of the goal there, part of the sort of ethos of that was to be apolitical, because you didn't want to, politics divided the church, and you were trying to unify. You were trying to bring in anybody, so you didn't put anything front and center that felt divisive, especially politics. Is that the solution here? Are you all talking about how do we depoliticize the church? How do we become apolitical? Or is that just a completely unrealistic idea and maybe always was?
I would say it's not to strip politics out of faith, because faith, especially Christian faith, actually has political ramifications. So it is not to strip politics, but it is actually to center politics on Jesus, not on a political party in terms of a tribal identity, but truly on Jesus. And this is where, as Russell talked about, shifting the definition of politics solely in this constricted fashion, where politics is defined by where you stand on substantive what issues, what candidate, what party, what policy do you support, and actually recapturing a broader, which I think is actually a biblical definition, but also a classic definition of politics, which is as much as concerned about the how, exactly like Russell talked about. How do we relate to one another? How do we speak about one another? Go to the Sermon on the Mount, and you'll be hard-pressed to draw a straight line from the Sermon on the Mount to any particular political party right now. You can try, but you're going to have to make a lot of moves, and other people of good faith are going to draw those lines differently. But there are clear statements in there that have direct line relevance to the how you treat one another. Do not lie. Do not call each other raka, idiot, moron, fool. Prioritize reconciliation over winning disputes, such that if you're on the way to a particular setting, a court setting that you think you're going to win the dispute, drop it and seek reconciliation first. Those are all political values that actually about the true meaning of politics, which is, as Aristotle said, is how does a polis, how does a community live together, even when they believe different things substantively on the what. So I think it's actually not stripping politics out, it's actually centering politics on Jesus.
Thank you. We've got time for maybe one more before I know we want to open it up to the audience. But Nancy, you sort of, you described being in a position where you were maybe a tool of polarization, where you were using rhetoric and going into these places where you might look back now and be like, I was contributing to this problem that I'm now trying to solve. And I think, Russell, you've also talked about this some in your book about working, for the policy arm of Southern Baptists and being very much having a political stance. So as you think about this work, is this a project of uniting conservatives, of sort of bringing back Christian nationalists into the fold, maybe, or is this broader than that? Is this something that's not just about uniting the church under a political stance?
I think it is that, right? Because I don't know if you guys would think this as well, but where I live in Tennessee, Christian nationalism is just very common. It's interwoven into, the way that I was raised, when you were talking about the hymns that might go with the after party, I was thinking, was it Onward Christian Soldiers? I know that. But you grow up in this certain way, and that might be a fine song. I have no idea. But so the Christian nationalists would be great to talk to and to bring into the fold. And there's no one that's beyond the reach. It's amazing. And Russell has heard the story, and Curtis has too. But I was even recently, my electric car died on Monteagle Mountain in Tennessee, and I was picked up by a Nazi. And I was in the car for 2 hours with him because I needed a tow, and I started putting things together. And finally, I just asked him after he kept using racial slurs. I was like, "If I was black, would you have said that?" And he revealed to me that he laughed, and he had a 9mm on his body, and I saw that too late. But when he started using racial slurs, I was like, "Is this what I'm going to do for 2 hours? Is listen to racial slurs and not say anything?" But as I've already previously confessed, I'm a little bit of a belligerent person, and so I just said, "If I was black, would you have done this?" And he laughs at me, and he says, "I hate everyone equally." And for some reason, I thought that was absurd, so I laughed. And I was like, "You do not. Because you're literally helping me in my duress right now." He was a volunteer firefighter. I was like, "You like your community more than I do. What's the real story?" And then I started noticing a bunch, and he said, I sort of disarmed him. And the reason I disarmed him, and this is sort of like what we're talking about, is I had a moment of fear because I realized I'd just rebuked the language of a Nazi, but I decided to treat him like my celebrity clients. And so I thought, I've got 2 hours. I'm going to find out everything about Nazis. And I asked him about his potlucks, who cooks, who cleans up, what do they eat, how do they fix their eyes on a target. It was harrowing. It really was. But I talked to him for 2 hours. And and I have an African-American daughter that we adopted from Ethiopia, and she's amazing. And he said, "I hope you're not offended. There's just good," and he used a racial slur, "and bad racial slurs." And I said, "Well, how do you tell the difference? Their shoes?" Because I've got a daughter, and people like you treat her terribly, and I'm sick of it. And by this time, we had established a relationship. And for 2 hours, we just chatted. And I challenged him, and he came back at me. And by the time we pulled up to my house, where David French was standing on the sidewalk, he had no idea. He kept texting me, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Sure." But he got out of the car, and he shook David's hand, and he said, "Well, you've got an interesting wife, don't you?" But then he said, "I've learned a lot." And we just had a really good conversation because I was interested in him. I was curious. I had a slight fight or flight thing, but I couldn't flight. I couldn't fight. So I just decided to ask questions. And it was a beautiful, sacred moment. And I think about him a lot. He had a really good soul, and he had left that situation that he was in, and he was trying to do better, but no one had ever confronted him about some stuff. And it was just a good conversation.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Let's open up to audience questions. We've got a few. I think there's a roving mic that is. There we go.
Justine.
Adam Taylor, serve as the president of Sojourners. Grateful for the panel. Really grateful for the work. I'm a fan of the after party, and grateful. It feels like there's kind of a surge of initiatives and efforts to try to do a lot of similar things. My question is a little bit of a nuance on the how, and I'm a huge supporter on your emphasis on the how, but I think we're in a moment where there's a lot of ways in which the how of our politics have become partisanized and politicized. And it's imperative that, we find ways to kind of build greater support around protecting some of those core principles: one person, one vote, the rule of law, agreeing to accepting the results of elections, et cetera. And so I'm kind of curious, from your experience with After Party so far, does that fit in the what, the kind of things that you want to avoid because it is divisive, or is that in the how because it's fundamental to how, as a country, we resolve disputes, at least partially through our democratic system?
Well, the accepting of elections would be in both the what and the how, because one of the things that we're attempting to help people break out of is this sense of every election as either being final exuberant victory or final existential defeat, which is what causes people to be able to rationalize using immoral means, because the other people are so awful that if they win, we have to do whatever it takes to keep them from winning. So accepting the rule of law and the norms of a society together and accepting elections is both. It's part of both of that. But the main thing is to say what we really need in this country is a progressive America that values America and one another and does not expect to be dominant and uniform, and a conservative America that likewise knows at the end of the day, no matter how an election turns out, we're going to have red states and blue states and purple states, and we're going to be able to coexist that way. That's both in terms of the what and the how for us.
I think we've got Kit. Yeah, we've got a couple. Oh,
I got a mic. Mark Silk. Audiences like this love people like you, and read you, and are happy. And there is a kind of statement that is made, appropriately, which is that we have our disagreements on policy continuing, but in the present circumstance, we have to be somewhere else politically. But I detect, but I'm asking, in this process of being ghosted in the ways that you have you changed any of your policy positions?
I have. I've changed my dispositionally in that I'm completely despondent and sad constantly after all of the contention. But that lament has actually caused me to rethink some things. Like, I'll just use one example, police brutality. I didn't understand it. In fact, I wrote articles about this topic in sort of a dismissive way. And when I realized, when like my side came against me, it took me a moment to just reflect on, wait, I thought we were the good guys. And then I started reevaluating like all of the positions. I'm still the same person I was when I put Ronald Reagan on my kindergarten walls or whatever. But like on police brutality, for example, I think that we had the wrong posture, we had the wrong facts. I was dismissing it. And, David and I talked about it a great deal, especially after George Floyd. I found myself at a Black Lives Matter rally with my kids, and I was like, what has happened to me? I've really changed. But then I thought I didn't really change. It's just like I acquired more information, if that makes sense. It's like I learned. And the reason I was able to learn is because I had been given the gift of social alienation, because I no longer had to carry the water for my freaking political party.
Anyone else? Oh, great.
Hi, Mark Beckwith. I work with Braver Angels, which is a movement to depolarize America, and having further conversations with some of you. Excuse me. One of the things we're doing is trying to put resources together for congregations, religious communities before the election and then also after the election. And my question to you is, and I don't want to sound catastrophizing, but from what I've heard, particularly at the end of the morning, what do we do about the potential for impending physical violence? What kind of witness do we need to make?
Well, I'll just say, the After Party book and the curriculum addresses this head on, that if there's one thing we know about Jesus historically, is that he died on the cross in a voluntary submission to his enemies and called his followers to do the same. And so the cross is as clear a renunciation of the use of violence to advance any aims, but especially your political aims. And so that, I don't know if that's a how or a what, I think it's both, but that has to be recaptured as a central proclamation of the gospel, that meaning of the cross. And so we do need to resource and equip our pastors and our churches in this season to be very clear about that and to set the norms for Christian behavior as well short of violence.
On January, I think it was the 7th of 2021, I was on Christian radio talking about the January 6th insurrection and my own dismay at all of it, but particularly at seeing a Jesus Saves sign there. And there were callers who were calling in, and I will never forget the one who said, well, yeah, but you say that shouldn't have happened, but how do you know whether you should be at a protest like that or whether you should leave? And I said, well, whatever kind of protest that you find yourself attending, if somebody's building a gallows, leave. That's just a general rule, and then we can go beyond that.
The Moore doctrine.
The Moore doctrine. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, this kind of least common denominator here. The main thing that we're attempting to do when it comes to heading off political violence is not so much with having people set out a game plan as to how to deal with specific scenarios, although many people do need to be doing that. I was doing that as recently as yesterday, gaming out potential scenarios and how we'll respond to it, as much as it is to shape and form intuitions and consciences to be able to recognize, wait, something's wrong here. With the way that the mob can light up a limbic system, to have people just to be able to step back and say, wait, this just doesn't seem right to me. That's a primary objective here, because part of what's happening is you have people who are in unexpected situations and who aren't even stepping back to ask, is this right? That's part of what we're seeking.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for questions and to our panel for sharing today. I think there we go. All right.
Thank you again. That was Roxanne Stone, the moderator, Nancy French, Curtis Chang, and Russell Moore.